On ridiculed farmer's daughter's last-minute discovery beneath her family's weathered barn unexpectedly reveals a priceless historical treasure trove that transforms a humiliating foreclosure auction into a National Heritage Site designation. Exposing a network of corrupt auction officials, counterfeit historical assessments, and powerful real estate investors, all brought crashing down when Smithsonian experts arrive with authentication documents that would not only save her ancestral. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Homestead but uncover a deliberate scheme to acquire historically significant properties at fraction of their true value, reaching into influential museum boardrooms across 3 states. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of dried leaves and desperation as Rebecca Hargrove parked her mud-spattered pickup truck in the furthest corner of the county courthouse parking lot. The 29-year-old archaeologist had spent the last 8 years building a promising career at a prestigious university in Boston, thousands of miles from the struggling Kentucky farm where she'd grown up. Now, with her father's recent stroke and the impending foreclosure, she found herself back in Milridge County, facing the unthinkable, watching the 180-acre property that had been in her family since 1887 sold to the highest bidder at today's land auction. The farm represented more than just acreage and buildings to the Hargroves. For 5 generations, her ancestors had worked the rolling hills, transforming dense woodland into productive fields, weathering economic depressions, surviving droughts, and gradually building a modest legacy of self-sufficiency and quiet dignity. The original homestead deed, signed by Rebecca's great-great-grandfather Jeremiah Hargrove, hung in a simple wooden frame above the fireplace mantel, a testament to the family's enduring connection to this particular patch of Kentucky soil. Rebecca glanced at her watch. 9:17 a.m. The auction was scheduled to begin at 10 sharp. Her father, Thomas Hargrove, sat silently beside her in the passenger seat, his weathered face impassive but for the occasional twitch at the corner of his mouth, a lingering effect of the stroke that had left him partially paralyzed just 4 months earlier. His medical bills had been the final financial blow to a farm already struggling through 3 consecutive years of drought and declining tobacco prices. "You ready for this, Dad?" Rebecca asked, reaching over to straighten his tie, a navy blue clip-on he'd insisted on wearing, despite her protest that it wasn't necessary. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the imposing limestone courthouse ahead. "Wanted to look proper," he said, the words coming deliberately through his partially affected speech. "Even if it's just to watch them take everything." Rebecca squeezed his hand. The medical expenses had quickly exhausted their insurance coverage and devoured their modest savings. The predatory refinancing loan her father had reluctantly accepted 2 years prior had seemed manageable then, but its ballooning interest rate had rendered the monthly payments impossible after his hospitalization. "We're not giving up yet," she said with more conviction than she felt. "The Historical Society letter might help." The letter, written by Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, the recently deceased County Historical Society president, suggested that the original Hargrove barn might have architectural significance worth preservation. While not officially binding, Rebecca hoped it might at least delay the proceedings long enough to explore other options. It was thin hope, but it was all they had. As they made their way toward the courthouse entrance, Rebecca spotted a gleaming black Range Rover pulling into a reserved parking space. From it emerged Clayton Sterling, the impeccably dressed CEO of Meridian Development Group, a luxury resort company that had been aggressively purchasing foreclosed rural properties throughout the region over the past 3 years. "There's Sterling," Rebecca muttered under her breath. Her father's jaw tightened visibly at the sight of the developer. Local rumors suggested Sterling maintained cozy relationships with county officials, who had mysteriously expedited zoning changes that transformed generational family farms into upscale vacation communities, catering to wealthy clientele from Louisville and Cincinnati. "Won't even look our way," Thomas observed as Sterling strode purposefully toward the building, flanked by two assistants carrying leather portfolios. "Man's bought half the county and can't even acknowledge the families. He's displacing." Inside the courthouse, the auction registration desk was already bustling with activity. Representatives from investment groups, development companies, and land speculation firms formed an orderly queue. Rebecca and Thomas joined the line, acutely aware that they had no realistic chance of outbidding these corporate interests. Their presence was symbolic, a final stand before surrendering their heritage. "Name?" asked the clerk without looking up from her computer. "Rebecca Hargrove. I'm here about the Hargrove property on Old Mill Road." The clerk frowned, checking her screen. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hargrove, but you're not eligible to participate in today's auction." "Excuse me?" Rebecca leaned forward, certain she had misheard. "According to our records, family members with direct interest in foreclosed properties may observe but cannot register as bidders." The clerk slid a visitor badge across the counter. "You can watch from the designated seating area, but you cannot participate in the bidding process." Rebecca felt heat rising in her cheeks. "That's absurd. There's no such restriction in the county auction guidelines. We have every right to bid on our own property." "It's a new policy implemented last month," the clerk replied mechanically. "I'm simply following the procedures I've been given." Thomas placed a steadying hand on his daughter's arm, his eyes communicating caution. Rebecca took a deep breath, her archaeologist's training in careful observation kicking in despite her anger. Something wasn't right. The clerk's averted gaze, the convenient new policy, the rushed auction scheduling. It all suggested manipulation beyond standard foreclosure proceedings. "We'd like documentation of this policy change," Rebecca said, her voice level despite her rising suspicion. "As a matter of public record." The clerk's composure faltered momentarily. "You'd need to file a formal information request with the county administrator's office. I don't have those documents here." As they moved away from the registration desk, Rebecca whispered to her father, "Dad, that's completely illegal. They can't block affected property owners from participating in public auctions without published notice and review." Thomas nodded grimly. "Doesn't matter if it's illegal if nobody stops them. This whole thing could be over in an hour." They made their way into the auction room, where Thomas immediately noticed several unfamiliar security personnel positioned. Near the exits, the men in dark suits communicated via discreet earpieces and seemed unnecessarily vigilant for a routine county land auction. Rebecca helped her father into a seat in the back row, then sat beside him, scanning the room with the methodical attention to detail that had made her a rising star in archaeological field research. Rebecca Hargrove had never planned to return to Millridge County for more than holiday visits. Her childhood on the farm had been happy but difficult. Constant financial strain, pre-dawn chores before school, and the perpetual uncertainty of agricultural life had driven her toward the structured predictability of academia. Her doctoral work in pre-colonial American artifacts had recently earned her a prestigious research position that she'd been forced to place on indefinite leave when her father's stroke upended everything. At 29, she embodied a striking blend of her rural upbringing and academic discipline. Her hands, though now more accustomed to careful excavation of delicate artifacts, still carried the calluses of farm work. Her practical knowledge of soil composition, initially gained through planting seasons with her father, had given her a uniquely intuitive understanding in her archaeological fieldwork. During her 8 years away, she had developed a reputation for finding historical significance in places others overlooked, a skill born from growing up in a community that outsiders routinely dismissed as unremarkable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas Hargrove had operated the family farm with unwavering determination through decades of agricultural challenges. At 68, he had weathered the tobacco industry's decline, adapted to changing markets, and maintained the property's integrity against constant pressure to sell to developers. His stroke had come without warning, collapsing in the field on a clear April morning while repairing fencing in the north pasture. The resulting medical bills had rapidly consumed the modest savings he'd accumulated through years of careful living. The Hargrove farm represented the last intact 19th-century homestead in a county that had once been defined by family agriculture. While neighboring properties had been sold off, subdivided, or converted to commercial use, Thomas had stubbornly preserved not just the land, but the original structures, particularly the hand-hewn timber barn built by his great-grandfather in 1887. The antiquated building had been a point of contention between father and daughter for years. Rebecca had argued for its historical documentation and preservation, while Thomas viewed it primarily as a working farm structure, despite its inconvenient layout for modern equipment. "They've moved our property to the beginning of the auction," Rebecca whispered, examining the lot listing on the printed program. "We were supposed to be third on the schedule." Thomas frowned. The Hargrove farm, while substantial at 180 acres, was less valuable than several other properties being auctioned today based on pure development potential. Yet somehow their land had been prioritized for immediate sale, with the auction time even moved up by an hour from the originally published schedule. "Why the rush?" Thomas murmured, his affected speech slowing his words but not dulling the suspicion in his voice. Before Rebecca could respond, she noticed Clayton Sterling engaged in intense conversation with County Commissioner James Wilson in a corner of the room. The two men repeatedly glanced in the Hargroves' direction, their expressions suggesting irritation at their presence rather than the sympathy one might expect for a family losing their generational home. "Something doesn't add up," Rebecca whispered. "Sterling looks nervous, not confident, and why would the commissioner himself be here for a routine land auction?" As she scanned the room more carefully, Rebecca noticed other unusual elements: the hasty way the auction staff were arranging the materials, the conspicuous absence of several regular attendees from previous county auctions, and most strikingly, the way certain officials seemed to be avoiding eye contact with the Hargroves entirely. Her academic training in analyzing historical sites had taught her to recognize patterns and anomalies, to identify when something didn't belong in the established context. Every instinct honed through years of archaeological fieldwork was now signaling that the scene unfolding before her was being deliberately orchestrated for reasons beyond a simple property foreclosure. The auctioneer approached the podium, shuffling papers with visible urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin today's proceedings with Lot 14, the Hargrove property on Old Mill Road. 180 acres with existing structures, zoned agricultural with pending reclassification for mixed-use development." Rebecca straightened in her seat. "Pending reclassification? That's news to us. When was this filed?" Her father shook his head slightly, his expression darkening. "The zoning change, if approved, would substantially increase the property's value for developers, but they had received no notification of any reclassification application as required by county regulations." As the auctioneer prepared to begin the bidding, Rebecca felt a sudden, overwhelming sense that they were missing something crucial. Her father had maintained the farm through far worse economic conditions than the current situation. The accelerated foreclosure process, the convenient policy preventing them from bidding, the unexplained zoning change, all suggested manipulation beyond standard financial pressures. She reached into her bag for Dr. Whitfield's letter, hoping it might at least force a temporary delay in the proceedings. The elderly historian had visited the farm 3 months earlier, showing unusual interest in the old barn's construction techniques and interior markings. Her subsequent letter had mentioned potential historical significance, but lacked specific details due to her unexpected passing before completing her assessment. "Dad," Rebecca whispered, "did Dr. Whitfield ever mention exactly what she found interesting about the barn?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "Just kept asking about the root cellar underneath. Said something about the stonework being unusual." Rebecca's mind raced. The root cellar beneath the barn was a feature she'd barely thought about since childhood. A musty, cobweb-filled space used for storing potatoes and preserves in her great-grandparents' era. She had played there as a child but hadn't entered it in at least 15 years. Did she take any photographs while she was there? "Some. On her phone," Thomas replied. "Said she needed to compare them with records at the Historical Society." The auctioneer's voice cut through their whispered conversation. "We'll start the bidding at $250,000. Do I hear $250,000? A representative from Meridian Development immediately raised his bidding paddle. Clayton Sterling sat behind him, his expression a mask of practiced indifference that failed to conceal the tension evident in his posture. Rebecca felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. Pulling it out discreetly, she saw a text message from Maria Gonzalez, Dr. Whitfield's assistant at the Historical Society. "Urgent. Found Whitfield's notes on your barn. Call immediately. Do not let auction proceed." Rebecca's heart raced as she read the message. She squeezed her father's hand and whispered, "I need to make a call. Stall them if you can." Thomas nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding passing. Between them, with the wordless communication developed through years of working side by side in challenging conditions. Despite their 8-year separation during Rebecca's academic pursuits, the father-daughter bond remained their core strength, a relationship forged through shared resilience against natural disasters, market fluctuations, and family tragedies. As Rebecca slipped out of the auction room, Thomas slowly raised his hand, drawing the auctioneer's reluctant attention. "Yes, Mr. Hargrove?" The auctioneer couldn't entirely mask his irritation at the interruption. Thomas deliberately took his time standing, using his cane for support. A calculated move that Rebecca would have recognized immediately as her father's strategic delay tactic. Though physically diminished by his stroke, Thomas Hargrove's mind remained sharp, and he understood the power of disrupting momentum. "I believe," he began, his affected speech naturally creating dramatic pauses, "that county regulations require full disclosure of pending zoning changes in auction documentation. Our paperwork shows no such notification." The auctioneer glanced nervously toward Commissioner Wilson, who had straightened in his seat at Thomas's challenge. Several potential bidders began murmuring among themselves, creating exactly the atmosphere of uncertainty Thomas had intended. Meanwhile, Rebecca huddled in a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway, phone pressed to her ear as Maria Gonzalez's excited voice poured through the speaker. "Rebecca, thank God you answered. Dr. Whitfield left a sealed envelope in her desk with strict instructions to open it only if the Hargrove property faced auction. I found it this morning while cataloguing her effects." The young historian's assistant spoke rapidly, her words tumbling over each other. "She believed your barn's root cellar contains remnants of an underground railroad station, a hidden chamber beyond the main storage area." Rebecca felt her breath catch. "The Underground Railroad? Are you certain?" The stonework pattern she photographed matches authenticated sites in 3 other counties. She was comparing documentation when she died. There's more. She found chisel marks consistent with pre-Civil War construction techniques that don't match your barn's 1887 date. She suspected the seller predates your family's ownership and was incorporated into the later structure. Rebecca's mind raced through the implications. If true, their property contained historically significant evidence of the secret network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom, a preserved site that could provide invaluable insights into this critical chapter of American history. She was planning to bring in specialists from the Smithsonian's African American History Museum for verification before approaching your family officially, Maria continued. She didn't want to raise false hopes, but her preliminary assessment suggested it might be one of the most intact stations still existing in this region. Where are her research materials now? Rebecca asked, archaeological training immediately focusing on documentation. In the Historical Society archives. I've compiled everything, including contacts for the Smithsonian experts she was corresponding with. Rebecca, if she's right, your property can't legally be developed without proper historical assessment. The auction should be halted immediately. I need those documents now, Maria. Can you bring them to the courthouse? Already on my way. Should be there in 15 minutes. Rebecca ended the call, her mind processing this revelation with the methodical analysis she applied to archaeological discoveries. The accelerated auction timeline, Sterling's unusual nervousness, the convenient policy preventing them from bidding, all suddenly made perfect sense if someone had learned about Dr. Whitfield's discovery and wanted to acquire the property before its historical significance became official. When Rebecca re-entered the auction room, she found her father engaged in what appeared to be a procedural debate with the county attorney, effectively delaying the start of bidding. Thomas caught her eye, raising an eyebrow in silent question. She gave him a subtle nod that communicated both urgency and hope, their long-established signal that a situation had changed in their favor. Making her way to her father's side, Rebecca addressed the room with the authoritative tone she typically reserved for academic conferences. I formally request this auction be suspended pending historical investigation of the property under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward her. Commissioner Wilson stepped forward, his forced smile failing to mask his discomfort. Ms. Hargrove, while we sympathize with your situation, unsubstantiated claims of historical significance cannot delay a properly noticed foreclosure auction. My claims are far from unsubstantiated, Rebecca countered, drawing on her professional credibility. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, prior to her death, documented evidence suggesting our property contains an intact underground railroad station predating the Civil War. Her research materials are en route to this courthouse now, along with correspondence from Smithsonian Institution specialists who were preparing to investigate the site. A murmur spread through the room. Clayton Sterling leaned forward to whisper urgently to his attorney, whose expression darkened visibly. Thomas watched his daughter with quiet pride. The determined young woman commanding the room's attention embodied everything he and his late wife Catherine had hoped to nurture when they'd supported their only child's academic ambitions, despite knowing it would likely take her far from the farm. Catherine, who had died of cancer when Rebecca was 19, had always insisted their daughter was meant for something beyond Millridge County. Yet here she was, using her hard-earned expertise to fight for the very land they'd feared she might never truly value. Commissioner Wilson attempted to regain control of the situation. Without official documentation, we cannot... Actually, interrupted a new voice from the back of the room, you can and must delay these proceedings under federal preservation guidelines. All heads turned to see Maria Gonzalez entering with a leather portfolio and what appeared to be original maps and photographs. The young assistant curator's normal shyness had been replaced by professional resolve as she approached the front of the room. These are Dr. Whitfield's original research materials, including correspondence with Dr. Harriet Coleman at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, confirming preliminary interest in the site based on photographic evidence. As Maria spread the documents on a side table, Rebecca noted Clayton Sterling's face had gone noticeably pale. Commissioner Wilson appeared equally unsettled, confirming her suspicion that they had somehow learned about Dr. Whitfield's discovery, perhaps even before the Hargroves themselves. Furthermore, Maria continued, producing an envelope sealed with the Historical Society's official stamp, this contains Dr. Whitfield's sworn affidavit regarding her findings, prepared specifically in the event of her death before completing the official designation process. The county attorney reluctantly took the envelope, examining its unbroken seal before carefully opening it. As he scanned the contents, his professional demeanor faltered momentarily. "This appears to be in order," he acknowledged, unable to find immediate grounds for dismissal. "It would be procedurally appropriate to temporarily suspend the auction pending verification of these claims." Clayton Sterling rose from his seat, his carefully cultivated public persona of philanthropic developer giving way to barely contained frustration. At 47, the CEO of Meridian Development represented the polished facade of progress that had been reshaping rural communities across 3 states for the past decade. His company's glossy brochures promised economic revitalization, luxury tourism opportunities, and tasteful preservation of rural character, all while systematically erasing the authentic agricultural heritage that had defined these regions. "For generations, this is highly irregular," Sterling declared, straightening his Italian suit jacket with manicured hands that had never known agricultural labor. "Every property faces claims of sentimental or historical value during foreclosure. If we suspended proceedings for unverified assertions, the entire system would grind to a halt." Rebecca studied him carefully. Unlike the genuinely uncertain commissioner or visibly uncomfortable county attorney, Sterling's reaction suggested not just annoyance, but something closer to panic beneath his controlled exterior. His eyes darted repeatedly to the documents Maria had spread across the table, not with curiosity, but with recognition. "These aren't sentimental claims, Mr. Sterling," Rebecca responded evenly. "They're preliminary findings from a qualified county historian, with Smithsonian consultation, and I find it interesting that you're more invested in proceeding with this specific auction than the county officials themselves." Sterling's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he forced a dismissive smile. "Meridian Development has legitimate interest in proper adherence to established foreclosure processes. Arbitrary delays based on convenient last-minute discoveries set concerning precedents." His emphasis on convenient carried clear insinuation of fabrication, a suggestion that made Thomas Hargrove's weather-worn face flush with indignation. Before Thomas could respond, however, Commissioner Wilson interjected with the practiced mediation of a career politician. Perhaps a reasonable compromise would be a 24-hour continuance to allow preliminary verification of these claims. If they prove without merit, the auction can proceed tomorrow without further delay. Rebecca recognized the suggestion for what it was, a minimal concession designed to appear reasonable while providing barely enough time for meaningful investigation. She opened her mouth to object when Maria Gonzalez surprised everyone by stepping forward. "Commissioner Wilson, weren't you present at the meeting 3 weeks ago when Dr. Whitfield initially reported her findings to the County Historical Preservation Committee?" Maria's voice remained professionally respectful, but her question landed with precision. "It's noted in the minutes that you requested her research remain confidential pending final assessment." Wilson's momentary hesitation confirmed Rebecca's growing suspicion that the officials had been aware of the potential historical significance before today's auction. That was a preliminary discussion about various properties with potential historical interest. Nothing specific was confirmed regarding the Hargrove site. The careful wording rang hollow even to the uninvolved observers in the room. Rebecca seized the opening. If the committee was aware of potential historical significance 3 weeks ago, why wasn't our family notified? And why was our property suddenly moved to the beginning of today's auction schedule? The ripple of murmurs through. The audience suggested these questions resonated beyond the Hargroves' personal situation. Other property owners facing foreclosure exchanged concerned glances, perhaps recognizing familiar patterns in their own accelerated proceedings. Clayton Sterling's attorney whispered something in his ear, prompting the developer to adopt a more conciliatory tone. In the interest of transparency, Meridian would support a brief continuance to resolve these questions. Perhaps 72 hours would be more appropriate to allow proper assessment. The strategic retreat caught Rebecca off guard until she noticed Sterling subtly checking his phone beneath the table. Something had changed in the dynamic. A new calculation that made delay suddenly acceptable to the previously impatient developer. Thomas Hargrove, whose quiet observation had been sharpened by decades of negotiating with buyers, dealers, and agricultural officials, caught the shift as well. He nudged his daughter gently and nodded toward the corridor outside the auction room, where increased activity had become visible through the glass doors. Rebecca's attention shifted to 3 individuals who had just entered the courthouse. Expensively dressed consultants with the unmistakable bearing of corporate damage control specialists. They stationed themselves discreetly near the exits, observing the proceedings with professional detachment, while occasionally touching their earpieces. "They're buying time," Thomas whispered, his farmer's intuition cutting through the procedural debate. "Something else is happening." As if confirming his assessment, Sterling's phone buzzed again. After checking it, the developer leaned forward to confer urgently with his legal team, their expressions growing increasingly concerned. Commissioner Wilson, meanwhile, had moved to consult with the county attorney and auction administrator, their huddle projecting growing uncertainty about how to proceed. The commissioner repeatedly glanced towards Sterling, seeming to seek guidance from the developer rather than leading the decision himself, a telling reversal of the official power. Dynamic. Rebecca turned to Maria. "What else do we need to know about Dr. Whitfield's research? Was anyone else involved?" Maria hesitated before responding quietly. She was collaborating with Professor James Harrison from State University's History Department. They were documenting a pattern of underground railroad stations along the North Fork River watershed. The name registered immediately. Professor Harrison had been Rebecca's undergraduate mentor before she'd specialized in archaeology, a respected historian whose integrity was beyond question. His involvement lent additional credibility to Dr. Whitfield's findings and explained Sterling's sudden willingness to delay. If Harrison had been involved, challenging the historical assessment would prove far more difficult. As the officials continued their private deliberation, Rebecca took the opportunity to examine Dr. Whitfield's materials more closely. The photographs showed distinctive stonework in the Hargrove barn's root cellar, patterns she'd never noticed, despite growing up exploring every corner of the property. One image in particular caught her attention, a seemingly ordinary stone, with a subtle carving that resembled a North Star, a known symbol used in the Underground Railroad to guide those seeking freedom. "Dad," she whispered, showing him the photograph, "did you know about this marking?" Thomas squinted at the image, genuine surprise crossing his face. "Never noticed it. That corner's always been used for potato storage, dark and easy to overlook." Their conversation was interrupted by the county attorney clearing his throat to address the room. In light of the documentation presented and the potential historical significance of the property, this auction will be temporarily suspended pending preliminary assessment. He glanced at Commissioner Wilson, who nodded stiffly. The proceedings will be continued for 72 hours until Friday at 10 a.m. Sterling immediately rose to confer with his team, his carefully maintained composure now visibly strained. Rebecca noticed him gesturing emphatically toward his phone while his attorney attempted to calm him, behavior inconsistent with someone who had just successfully negotiated a preferred delay. As the room began to clear, Commissioner Wilson approached the Hargroves with a transparency so forced it bordered on theatrical. Ms. Hargrove, I want to assure you the county takes historical preservation very seriously. We'll ensure proper procedures are followed from this point forward. Rebecca met his gaze directly, including an explanation of why our property was prioritized for auction despite known historical questions, and why we were prevented from bidding on our own land. Wilson's smile faltered. Administrative oversights happen in complex proceedings. Rest assured, they'll be reviewed thoroughly. As the commissioner retreated, Thomas leaned heavily on his cane, the morning's tension visibly taking a toll on his recovery. They're scrambling, he observed quietly. But why? The answer began to materialize as they exited the courthouse. A local news van had arrived in the parking lot, and a reporter was setting up for a live broadcast. More telling was the presence of a modest sedan with State University markings parked beside Maria's car. That's Professor Harrison's vehicle, Rebecca noted, recognizing her former mentor's decade-old Toyota with its distinctive bumper stickers supporting historical preservation causes. Before they could investigate further, Clayton Sterling intercepted them at the courthouse steps, his public relations smile firmly back in place, though it failed to reach his eyes. Two of his associates positioned themselves strategically nearby, creating an illusion of privacy while ensuring the conversation remained under their observation. Ms. Hargrove, Mr. Hargrove, Sterling began with practiced cordiality. I want to personally express Meridian's support for proper historical assessment. Our company has always prioritized heritage preservation in our development projects. Rebecca met his gaze steadily, her archaeological training having taught her to recognize disturbed soil hiding something beneath the surface. Interesting, considering Meridian's Cedar Creek development completely demolished the Jenkins homestead last year, a property over 150 years old with documented historical features. Sterling's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. An unfortunate situation where structural issues made preservation impossible, but I'm not here to discuss past projects. He lowered his voice, glancing at Thomas with calculated sympathy. I understand your family's attachment to the property. Regardless of the historical assessment outcome, Meridian would be willing to offer a private purchase agreement significantly above market value. You could relocate to more suitable accommodations, while maintaining financial security, particularly important given your health considerations. The thinly veiled reference to Thomas's medical condition, information Sterling should have had no access to beyond general public knowledge, confirmed Rebecca's suspicion that the developer had been monitoring the Hargrove situation closely. Thomas straightened to his full height, his farmer's dignity overcoming physical limitation. Mr. Sterling, this land has been in my family for 5 generations. It's not just property to be liquidated for suitable accommodations. Sentiments every farmer expresses, Sterling replied, his tone managing to be simultaneously sympathetic and dismissive. But the economic realities of modern agriculture have changed. Struggling family farms are becoming unsustainable relics. Our farm isn't struggling because of economic realities, Rebecca interjected sharply. It's facing foreclosure because predatory loan terms coincided with a medical crisis. There's a difference. Sterling's expression hardened momentarily before he regained his professional veneer. Be that as it may, the auction has only been delayed, not cancelled. Historical designation could tie your property up in bureaucratic assessment for months or years, during which your financial obligations continue accumulating. My offer represents a practical solution. Rebecca studied him carefully. You seem remarkably interested in one specific property, Mr. Sterling. There are dozens of farms available in this county without potential historical complications. Meridian's development strategy targets key properties with specific characteristics. Your location at the convergence of the county road and river makes it particularly suitable for our planned riverside complex. The explanation sounded plausible on the surface, but Rebecca's instincts suggested something more specific about their property had captured Sterling's attention, something beyond commercial development potential. We'll consider all options. After the historical assessment, she replied neutrally, unwilling to reveal their suspicions. Sterling handed her a business card with his personal number handwritten on the back. My offer stands for the next 48 hours only. After that, market forces will determine the outcome. The implicit threat hung in the air between them as he turned and walked toward his waiting Range Rover. Pleasant fellow, Thomas remarked dryly once Sterling was out of earshot. Reminds me of those fertilizer salesmen who show up after drought years, all sympathy while tripling their prices. Rebecca couldn't help smiling at her father's assessment. Despite everything they faced, Thomas Hargrove's fundamental character remained unshaken. The same quiet strength and clear-eyed judgment that had guided the farm through previous crises. Their momentary respite was interrupted by Maria hurrying toward them, accompanied by a white-haired man Rebecca immediately recognized as Professor James Harrison. At 72, the distinguished historian had lost none of the intellectual intensity that had inspired Rebecca's own academic pursuits years earlier. Rebecca Hargrove, he greeted her warmly, clasping her hand in both of his. When Maria called me about Eleanor's findings, I had no idea you were connected to this property. It's been, 10 years since my American history seminar. 8 years, Professor. It's good to see you. Harrison turned to Thomas with genuine respect. Mr. Hargrove, I deeply regret meeting under these circumstances. Eleanor Whitfield spoke very highly of you and your commitment to maintaining your property's historical integrity. Thomas nodded appreciatively. Dr. Whitfield was a fine woman. Spent hours asking about that old barn. Never mentioned anything about the Underground Railroad, though. She was cautious by nature, Harrison explained. Historical verification requires methodical documentation to avoid false claims. She had nearly completed her assessment when she passed, but needed final confirmation from structural experts. Rebecca gestured toward the news van. The local station seems interested in our situation. Harrison's expression turned grave. That's partially my doing. When Maria informed me about today's auction, I contacted several preservation advocacy groups. Once I mentioned potential Underground Railroad connections, media interest followed naturally. Public attention can provide temporary protection while formal assessment proceeds. The strategic manipulation of public opinion didn't surprise Rebecca. Harrison had always emphasized that historical preservation sometimes required political maneuvering alongside academic rigor. What surprised her was how quickly the situation had escalated from a private foreclosure to a public confrontation with broader implications. As if confirming this transformation, the courthouse doors opened and Commissioner Wilson emerged with the county attorney, both looking distinctly uncomfortable at the sight of news cameras. When they spotted Harrison, their discomfort visibly intensified. James, Wilson acknowledged stiffly, I wasn't aware you were involved in this matter. Eleanor brought me into her research 6 months ago, Harrison replied pleasantly, though Rebecca detected the subtle steel beneath his cordial tone. We were preparing a joint paper on underground railroad networks in river watershed communities, fascinating historical patterns emerging from the documentation. The commissioner's forced smile barely masked his concern. The county fully supports historical research, of course. We'll ensure all proper protocols are followed regarding the Hargrove property, including explanation of why normal auction procedures were modified specifically for this property, Harrison inquired, with the innocent tone of a scholar merely, seeking factual clarity, a technique Rebecca remembered well from his devastating seminar critiques. Wilson's expression tightened. Administrative decisions regarding foreclosure proceedings fall under standard county protocols. If you'll excuse me, we have several matters requiring attention following the auction delay. As the officials retreated into the courthouse, Harrison turned to the Hargroves with the focused energy that had made him a formidable advocate for historical preservation throughout his career. "They're concealing something beyond routine procedural manipulation," he observed. "Eleanor mentioned encountering unusual resistance when she tried to access certain county land records, specifically original property surveys along the river watershed. Could the Underground Railroad connection be that significant?" Rebecca asked, professional curiosity merging with personal stake. "Potentially. Eleanor believed your property might contain not just a station, but documentation, preserved records or artifacts that could provide unprecedented insights into how the network operated in this region." Thomas frowned thoughtfully. "The route. Cellar has a false wall I've never thought much about. Assumed it was just odd construction. My grandfather mentioned it once when I was young, said some things weren't meant to be disturbed." Harrison's eyes widened at Thomas's casual revelation. "A false wall? That wasn't in Eleanor's notes." "Never mentioned it to her," Thomas admitted. "Didn't seem important at the time. Just an old family quirk. Never store anything against that north wall." Rebecca stared at her father in astonishment. "Dad, how could you never mention this?" Thomas shrugged with the pragmatism of a man who had lived his entire life prioritizing function over history. "It's just been there, like the creek bend or the old oak tree, part of the place. Never thought to question it." This new information transformed their understanding of Dr. Whitfield's interest in the property. What the historian had identified, through methodical research, the Hargrove family had unknowingly preserved through generations of quiet respect for their predecessors' implicit boundaries. "We need to document that area immediately," Harrison declared, his academic excitement barely contained. Before he stopped abruptly as Maria discreetly touched his arm, nodding toward the parking lot where a black SUV with tinted windows had parked. A man in a suit remained inside, photographing their gathering with a telephoto lens. "We're being monitored," Maria murmured. Rebecca assessed the situation with the strategic thinking she'd developed during remote archaeological expeditions where unexpected challenges frequently arose. "We should continue this conversation elsewhere. Dad needs to rest anyway. My office at the Historical Society would be secure," Maria suggested. "We have proper equipment for reviewing Eleanor's complete research materials." As they prepared to leave, Rebecca noticed increased activity around the courthouse, additional county vehicles arriving, staff members moving with unusual urgency, and most tellingly, Clayton Sterling engaged in what appeared to be a heated, phone conversation beside his Range Rover. His typically composed demeanor had given way to agitated gestures and visible frustration. Once they were settled in Maria's modest Civic and driving toward the Historical Society building, Rebecca shared her observations. "Sterling's behavior seems inconsistent with someone simply interested in commercial development. This feels more personal." "Eleanor thought so too," Maria confirmed, navigating the familiar streets of Millridge with the cautious attention of someone aware they might be followed. About a month before she died, she mentioned feeling pressured to abandon her research into river properties, said someone had accessed her office after hours. Was anything taken? Rebecca asked, professional alarm rising at the thought of research theft. Not that she could identify immediately, but her files had been disturbed, particularly her correspondence with the Smithsonian. Harrison, who had insisted on riding with them rather than taking his own vehicle, leaned forward from the back seat. Eleanor contacted me the week before she died. She'd discovered something significant but wouldn't discuss it by phone. We scheduled a meeting. His voice faltered briefly. For the day after she passed. The implication hung heavily in the confined space of the car. Thomas, who had remained thoughtfully quiet, finally spoke. Heart attack, wasn't it? Same as Judge Callahan last year, when he was investigating those water rights disputes. The parallel wasn't lost on Rebecca. Both deaths, natural on the surface but convenient in timing, had occurred just as significant challenges to development interests were materializing. Eleanor had a heart condition, Maria acknowledged hesitantly, but she was managing it carefully. Her doctor was surprised by the sudden deterioration. As they approached the Historical Society, Rebecca noticed another black SUV parked across the street, similar to the one at the courthouse. We've got company. Same model vehicle that was watching us earlier. Maria tensed, but maintained her course, pulling into the private parking area behind the Historical Society building. We can enter through the back. I have all Eleanor's materials. Secured in the research room. Once inside, the small group gathered around a large table where Maria had arranged Dr. Whitfield's extensive documentation. Photographs, maps, historical surveys, and correspondence with Smithsonian experts covered the surface in meticulously organized sections. Eleanor was building a comprehensive case, Harrison explained as he examined the materials. She believed several properties along the river, including the Hargrove Farm, formed a connected network of underground railroad stations strategically positioned near water routes. Rebecca's archaeological training immediately engaged with the physical evidence before her. These stone patterns are consistent with documented stations in Kentucky and southern Ohio, but this is different. She pointed to a specific photograph of markings in their root cellar. This star marking has additional notches that don't match standard navigational symbols. Harrison nodded, excitement building in his scholarly expression. Eleanor suspected your site might contain what we've long theorized but never confirmed, a documentation center where records of movements were temporarily preserved. Thomas leaned forward to examine the photograph more carefully. That section of the cellar floods occasionally during heavy spring rains. Always figured that's why the false wall was built, to keep storage dry, or to protect something during rare flooding events while maintaining access the rest of the time, Rebecca suggested, her mind racing with professional implications. If escaped individuals needed to be moved during storms when river travel became dangerous, having records of alternative routes would be crucial. A sudden knock at the building's back entrance startled them. Maria checked the security monitor, and her expression shifted from concern to surprise. It's Dr. Coleman from the Smithsonian. Maria hurried to unlock the door, admitting a distinguished black woman in her 60s, whose professional demeanor carried the unmistakable authority of someone at the pinnacle of her field. Dr. Harriet Coleman, Senior Curator of Underground Railroad History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, entered with purposeful strides, followed by two younger colleagues carrying specialized equipment cases. Professor Harrison, she acknowledged with a brief nod, before turning to the Hargroves. Ms. Hargrove, Mr. Hargrove, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but events are moving quickly. Rebecca recognized Dr. Coleman from academic publications and documentary appearances, a leading expert whose research had transformed understanding of how the Underground Railroad functioned as an organized resistance network rather than merely a series of random safe houses. You're aware of our situation? Rebecca asked, professional respect momentarily overriding her surprise at the curator's unexpected appearance. More than aware. I've been monitoring it since Eleanor Whitfield first contacted our department 6 months ago. Dr. Coleman set her leather portfolio on the table. When Professor Harrison alerted us about today's auction attempt, I expedited travel arrangements. What's happening here extends far beyond a single property dispute. Thomas straightened in. His chair, the gravity of Dr. Coleman's presence, not lost on him despite his unfamiliarity with academic hierarchies. Our farm is that significant? Potentially groundbreaking, Coleman confirmed, opening her portfolio to reveal official Smithsonian documentation. Dr. Whitfield's preliminary findings suggested your property might contain the only intact record-keeping site ever discovered along the Ohio River watershed routes. She spread several documents across the table: official authentication protocols, preliminary designation paperwork, and most significantly, federal protection orders already signed and requiring only final site confirmation to become immediately enforceable. The Smithsonian Institution is prepared to formally designate your property as a historic site of national significance pending verification of key structural elements. Her tone shifted from academic to personal as she addressed Thomas directly. Mr. Hargrove, your family's unconscious preservation of this site, particularly maintaining the barn structure without significant modification, may have protected an irreplaceable piece of American history. The unmistakable sound of vehicles arriving outside interrupted their conversation. Maria checked the security monitor, and her expression tightened. Commissioner Wilson is here with the county attorney. Clayton Sterling is with them. Dr. Coleman exchanged a meaningful glance with Harrison. Earlier than expected, they must have sources within the courthouse who witnessed our arrival. Rather than showing concern, the Smithsonian curator appeared almost satisfied by this development, as though anticipating a confrontation. She nodded to her colleagues, who immediately began unpacking their equipment: specialized imaging tools, documentation materials, and what appeared to be official federal designation markers. Ms. Hargrove, Coleman addressed Rebecca, as a professional archaeologist, you understand the protocols for securing potentially significant historical sites. I'm officially requesting your permission, as property representative, to implement emergency preservation measures under Section 10 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Rebecca recognized the strategic maneuver immediately. By formally initiating federal preservation protocols, Coleman was establishing procedural protection that would supersede county jurisdiction, effectively removing control from local officials before they could interfere further. You have my full permission, Rebecca confirmed, matching the curator's formal tone. As Coleman's team began their preparations, Maria reluctantly admitted the county officials. Commissioner Wilson entered with forced confidence that faltered visibly upon seeing the Smithsonian credentials displayed prominently on the table. Clayton Sterling followed, momentarily speechless at the unexpected gathering, before quickly composing himself. Dr. Coleman, Wilson began, attempting to project authority despite his evident discomfort. This is an unexpected development in what is essentially a local property matter. On the contrary, Commissioner, Coleman replied with professional courtesy that did nothing to soften her clear assertion of jurisdiction. The Smithsonian Institution has been investigating the historical significance of the Hargrove property since receiving Dr. Whitfield's initial documentation last December. Federal interest in this site considerably predates today's irregular auction attempt. Sterling stepped forward, abandoning any pretense of disinterest. With all due respect to historical research, there are established procedures for property designation that occur separate from foreclosure processes. The auction delay is meant to allow preliminary assessment, not circumvent legal financial obligations. Coleman turned to face the developer directly. her expression conveying not just professional authority but personal determination shaped by decades fighting to preserve erased African-American history. Mr. Sterling, the Smithsonian is implementing emergency preservation protocols due to evidence suggesting deliberate attempts to expedite disposal of a historically significant property before proper assessment could occur. She retrieved a document from her portfolio and placed it deliberately on the table. This federal injunction, signed yesterday by Judge Marcus Williams of the Eastern District Court, specifically prohibits any auction, sale, or transfer of the Hargrove property pending comprehensive historical assessment. The county attorney leaned forward to examine the document, his expression quickly shifting from skepticism to recognition of its legal validity. "This appears to be properly executed," he acknowledged reluctantly, "though the county should have been notified." "Notification was sent to the county administrator's office 48 hours ago," Coleman stated, with precision that suggested extensive documentation. "We have confirmed receipt by your staff. The more interesting question is why that information wasn't shared with relevant departments, particularly those scheduling today's auction." Commissioner Wilson's composure cracked visibly. "There must have been an administrative oversight, one of many surrounding this property," Harrison interjected, his academic demeanor giving way to barely contained indignation. "Including the convenient loss of Eleanor Whitfield's initial historical significance report filed with your office 3 months ago." Rebecca observed Sterling during this exchange, noting how his attention remained fixed not on the legal documents but on the photographs of the root cellar markings spread across the table. His expression betrayed more than frustration at bureaucratic obstacles. There was recognition and something that looked remarkably like fear. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of a local news crew at the Historical Society's front entrance. Through the window, Rebecca could see the reporter who had been setting up at the courthouse earlier, now accompanied by a cameraman and what appeared to be a state-level media van. Sterling noticed as well, his composure further deteriorating. "This historical assessment should be conducted without media sensationalism. Public speculation before proper verification undermines the integrity of the process." Interesting concern coming from someone with no official role in preservation. "Procedures," Dr. Coleman observed. "The Smithsonian welcomes transparency in our assessment work. Historic discoveries belong to the American public." The dynamic shifted as one of Coleman's colleagues approached with a tablet displaying results from preliminary scans of the root cellar photographs. He whispered something to the curator, whose eyes widened slightly before she regained her professional demeanor. "Ms. Hargrove, Mr. Hargrove," Coleman addressed them directly, deliberately excluding the others. "We've identified specific structural markers consistent with documented Underground Railroad communication centers. The Smithsonian formally requests immediate access to your property to implement protective measures around the barn structure." Before either Hargrove could respond, Sterling interjected with unexpected vehemence. "This entire situation reeks of orchestrated intervention. A failing farm facing legitimate foreclosure suddenly becomes a historic treasure the moment auction begins. The timing is suspiciously convenient." "Actually," Harrison countered, producing a leather-bound journal from his briefcase, "Eleanor Whitfield documented her initial observations regarding the Hargrove property 13 months ago, well before any foreclosure proceedings. This research timeline is extensively recorded." As if sensing his tenuous position, Commissioner Wilson attempted a conciliatory approach. "The county fully supports historical preservation within proper procedures. Perhaps a cooperative assessment involving both county and federal representatives would best serve all interests." "Your sudden enthusiasm for cooperation is noteworthy," Coleman replied evenly, "considering the county has ignored 3 formal requests for historical surveys along the river watershed over the past 2 years. While this exchange continued, Rebecca noticed Maria discreetly examining something on her computer, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When their eyes met, Maria subtly tilted her screen, showing Rebecca what had captured her attention: property records for adjacent land parcels recently acquired by Sterling's development companies under various corporate entities, forming a complete circle around the Hargrove farm. The pattern was unmistakable: systematic acquisition, creating a buffer of controlled properties surrounding the one parcel they couldn't directly acquire due to the Hargroves' refusal to sell. A strategy that made little sense for normal commercial development, but would be essential for controlling access to a site containing something someone wanted concealed. Rebecca subtly signaled her father, who had been quietly observing the confrontation, with the patient assessment of a man accustomed to waiting out storms. Thomas nodded, almost imperceptibly, understanding passing between them as it had countless times during farm crises. "Dr. Coleman," Rebecca addressed the curator while pulling up the county's public GIS mapping system on her phone, "I'd like to show you something potentially relevant to your assessment. Recent property acquisitions in direct proximity to our farm." As she displayed the ownership pattern, Coleman's professional interest immediately engaged. "This is consistent with what Eleanor suspected: strategic control of surrounding access points. Consistent with standard development practices," Sterling interjected hastily. "Proper land assembly ensures cohesive implementation of integrated projects. Yet your public development plans show proposed construction concentrated miles from this location," Harrison noted, consulting his notes. "This particular riverbend has been conspicuously absent from Meridian's published proposals, despite your aggressive acquisition strategy." The county attorney, who had remained largely silent during the confrontation, finally spoke. "I believe we're diverging from the immediate matter of auction suspension. If federal designation is pending, proper protocols should be followed by all parties, including disclosure of relevant communications," Coleman agreed, producing another document. From her portfolio, such as this email exchange between Commissioner Wilson and Meridian Development discussing, and I quote, "expediting disposal of the Hargrove property before external interference complicates acquisition." Wilson's face paled visibly. "That's taken out of context." "The context appears quite clear," Coleman continued relentlessly, "particularly when viewed alongside similar communications regarding other historic properties systematically removed from preservation consideration over the past 3 years under your administration." Rebecca watched Sterling during this revelation, noting how his attention had shifted from defensive posturing to silent calculation, the response of someone assessing damage control rather than defending principles. Thomas, who had remained remarkably patient throughout the increasingly tense exchange, finally spoke with the straightforward clarity that had guided his farming decisions for decades. "There's something in our cellar beyond historical markers, isn't there?" He addressed Sterling directly. "Something valuable enough to arrange special auction rules, rush proceedings, and buy every surrounding property." The directness of the question created a momentary silence, broken by the unexpected arrival of another key player. Through the Historical Society's front door came Sheriff Nathan Davis, a lifelong Millridge County resident whose family had served in local law enforcement for 3 generations. His expression was grave as he entered the research room, nodding respectfully to Thomas before addressing the group. "Pardon the interruption, but I've just received concerning information that appears relevant to this situation." He turned specifically toward Commissioner Wilson. "My office was contacted by the State Attorney General regarding irregularities in recent property transactions along the river corridor. They've requested immediate security measures for the Hargrove property pending investigation." The sheriff's arrival represented more than additional authority. As a respected local figure whose integrity remained unquestioned through decades of service, his presence legitimized the escalating concerns in ways outsiders alone could not achieve. Sterling attempted to reassert control of the narrative. "Sheriff, this appears to be coordinated interference in legitimate business and government operations based on speculative historical claims." "My concern isn't historical claims, Mr. Sterling," the sheriff interrupted calmly. "It's the pattern of document manipulation, procedural irregularities, and potential intimidation surrounding specific properties, all occurring after Dr. Whitfield's unexpected death." The sheriff's mention of potential intimidation dramatically shifted the atmosphere in the room. Dr. Coleman exchanged meaningful glances with Harrison before carefully gathering certain documents from the table. "Sheriff Davis," she said, "the Smithsonian has been conducting a parallel investigation regarding interference with historical research, specifically targeting Dr. Whitfield's work. We've documented numerous concerning incidents, including unauthorized access to her research materials and unusual timing of administrative obstacles." Davis nodded solemnly. "The state investigation has identified similar patterns, which is why—" He turned directly to Wilson. "The Attorney General's office has requested temporary suspension of Commissioner Wilson's authority regarding any properties connected to Dr. Whitfield's research pending review of communication records." Wilson's face flushed with indignation. "This is outrageous. The county commission has full jurisdiction over local property matters, except when superseded by state investigation into potential misconduct," the sheriff replied evenly. "The county administrator has been notified and has temporarily assigned oversight to Deputy Commissioner Reynolds." The calculated precision of this intervention suggested coordination between multiple agencies, a response far beyond what a simple property dispute would normally trigger. Rebecca noticed Sterling discreetly texting beneath the table, his earlier confidence now replaced by evident anxiety. The county attorney, reading the shifting power dynamics with the pragmatism of a career bureaucrat, distanced himself from his colleague. "The county legal department will naturally cooperate fully with all appropriate authorities. If procedural irregularities have occurred, they should be identified and corrected." As if responding to an unseen cue, Dr. Coleman's colleagues began carefully documenting and securing the research materials spread across the table. The methodical process carried the unmistakable authority of federal evidence collection rather than academic research, a distinction not lost on Wilson, whose bluster had given way to visible concern. "We'll continue this discussion at my office," Sheriff Davis announced, addressing Wilson directly. "The state investigators have specific questions regarding recently modified property records." The implications hung heavily in the room. What had begun as a contested auction had escalated to potential criminal investigation with remarkable speed. Thomas caught Rebecca's eye, his expression reflecting the stunned realization that their personal struggle had uncovered something far larger than a simple foreclosure dispute. As Wilson reluctantly followed the sheriff toward the door, Sterling made a final attempt to salvage control of the situation. "This overreaction to standard business practices threatens the economic development of the entire region. My legal team will—" He was interrupted by the arrival of two state police officers at the Historical Society entrance, their presence marking another significant escalation. Sheriff Davis acknowledged them with a brief nod before addressing Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, the state investigators have also expressed interest in reviewing Meridian Development's acquisition patterns and communication records regarding river corridor properties. They're particularly interested in connections between your company and several recently created investment entities purchasing adjacent parcels." The strategic mention of recently created investment entities visibly unsettled Sterling. confirming Rebecca's suspicion that the surrounding property acquisitions had been deliberately obscured through corporate shells, a tactic inconsistent with legitimate development but essential for concealing coordinated control. As Sterling was escorted outside to speak with the state officers, Dr. Coleman turned to the Hargroves with newfound urgency. "We need to document your property immediately, before any evidence can be compromised. Whatever historical significance triggered this level of interference must be substantial, beyond even what Eleanor initially suspected." Thomas nodded, the farmer's practical nature reasserting itself despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Our truck's outside. Let's go see what all this fuss is really about." The drive back to the Hargrove farm took place in a convoy that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier. The family's weather-beaten pickup truck, leading Dr. Coleman's official Smithsonian vehicle, Professor Harrison's sedan, and estate. Police cruiser providing security. The rural landscape passing outside the windows remained unchanged, yet everything about their understanding of it had transformed. "I've spent my whole life on that land," Thomas remarked quietly, as Rebecca navigated the familiar country roads. "Walked every inch of it since I could walk. Strange to think there was something significant there all along that I never really saw." "You saw it, Dad," Rebecca corrected gently. "You just didn't know what you were seeing. Your respect for the property preserved it when others might have modernized everything." As they approached the farm entrance, Rebecca noticed unfamiliar tire tracks in the gravel driveway, recent impressions suggesting someone had visited during their absence. Thomas noticed as well, his expression darkening with the protective instinct of a man whose property had been encroached upon. "Sheriff," Rebecca called out as they parked, indicating the fresh tracks. The officer immediately radioed for backup while directing the state police to conduct a perimeter check of the property. Dr. Coleman approached, her professional demeanor now tinged with visible concern. "Unfortunately, this isn't unexpected. If our suspicions are correct, securing whatever is hidden in your barn has become the priority for several interested parties." The group proceeded cautiously toward the weathered structure that had stood on the property since 1887. Though Rebecca had seen it countless times throughout her life, she now viewed it through new eyes, not merely as a utilitarian farm building, but as a deliberate construction, potentially designed to conceal something of historical significance beneath its ordinary appearance. The barn's heavy wooden doors creaked open to reveal the familiar interior, farm equipment, storage areas, and the worn steps leading down to the root cellar. A state officer confirmed the building was currently unoccupied, though several storage containers appeared to have been recently disturbed. "Someone was definitely here," Thomas observed, pointing to fresh mud on the normally dusty cellar steps. "And they were in a hurry." The group descended carefully into the cool darkness of the underground space, battery-powered lights illuminating the stone walls and dirt floor. For Rebecca, the root cellar carried memories of childhood explorations and farm chores, a familiar space now transformed by new understanding into something potentially extraordinary. Dr. Coleman moved with practiced precision, directing her team to photograph and document every aspect of the space before any detailed examination began. Standard preservation protocol requires establishing baseline documentation before investigation, she explained, particularly when evidence of recent disturbance exists. Thomas led them directly to the north wall, the section his family had traditionally left undisturbed through generations. To casual observation, it appeared indistinguishable from the surrounding stonework, but when Harrison directed specialized lighting at an angle across the surface, subtle irregularities became visible. "Look here," the professor indicated, tracing what appeared to be deliberate seams in the mortar. This section was designed to appear continuous with the surrounding wall while actually being removable. As the Smithsonian team carefully examined the wall, Sheriff Davis approached with information from his deputies. "We've identified multiple sets of recent footprints around the property perimeter. Someone was conducting extensive surveillance, possibly for days." This confirmation of sustained interest in the property expanded Rebecca's understanding of the situation's scope. Whatever historical significance lay hidden within their modest farm had attracted not just academic curiosity, but systematic monitoring and potentially illegal intervention. Dr. Coleman completed her initial documentation and turned to Thomas. "Mr. Hargrove, as the property owner, I need your explicit permission before we attempt to examine behind this wall section. This constitutes formal investigation of a potential historical site under federal protocols." Thomas nodded without hesitation. "Do whatever's needed. If something important's been hiding on my land all this time, it deserves to be properly understood." As Coleman's team prepared specialized equipment for the careful examination, Rebecca noticed Harrison studying old property maps with growing excitement. "Your farm's location wasn't just convenient to the river," he explained, spreading the documents for her to see. "It sits at the convergence of 3 underground pathways, documented in freedom seeker accounts, a perfect location for a coordination point where information could be exchanged." With meticulous care that reflected decades of experience with fragile historical artifacts, Dr. Coleman's team began the delicate process of examining the false wall. Specialized tools allowed them to map the structure using ground-penetrating radar before attempting any physical investigation, revealing a concealed space approximately 3 feet deep behind the visible stonework. "There's definitely a chamber," confirmed the technician operating the equipment, "and it contains multiple distinct objects, some with metallic components." Following established preservation protocols, they carefully documented every step as they prepared to access the hidden space. Small cameras inserted through nearly invisible gaps provided the first glimpses of what lay behind the wall, revealing a narrow chamber lined with additional stonework that had protected its contents from moisture and deterioration for more than a century and a half. "Mr. Hargrove," Dr. Coleman addressed Thomas with unconcealed excitement beneath her professional demeanor, "we're ready to attempt opening the access point. Historical documentation suggests these chambers were designed with deliberate mechanisms rather than requiring dismantling." Thomas nodded, watching with quiet amazement as his family's ordinary root cellar transformed into a site of historic significance before his eyes. Rebecca stayed close to her father, equally transfixed by the unfolding discovery that connected their personal heritage to a pivotal chapter in American history. Following the subtle patterns in the stonework that Dr. Whitfield had first identified, Coleman applied gentle pressure to specific points in a sequence suggested by similar sites. After several attempts, a section of the wall shifted almost imperceptibly, revealing cleverly disguised hinges that had remained functional despite the passage of time. "Remarkable craftsmanship," Harrison murmured, "designed to be nearly invisible yet accessible to those who knew the method." With painstaking care, the team slowly opened the concealed door, documenting each moment with multiple cameras. What emerged from the darkness left even the experienced Smithsonian experts momentarily speechless. The hidden chamber contained a small wooden cabinet, its construction simple but purposeful. Inside, protected from time and elements, lay several leather-bound ledgers, a metal container sealed with wax, maps carefully preserved between sheets of oilcloth, and most surprisingly, a collection of small personal objects, buttons, hand-carved, wooden figures, fabric scraps with distinct patterns, and what appeared to be carefully preserved notes written on various materials. "This is unprecedented," Coleman whispered, her professional reserve momentarily overcome by the magnitude of the discovery. A preserved documentation site with intact records and personal artifacts, possibly the most comprehensive underground railroad archive ever discovered in its original location. With reverent care, the team began cataloging each item without removing anything from its protective environment. The ledgers, when carefully examined with specialized lighting that wouldn't damage the fragile pages, revealed meticulous records of individuals passing through the region, not identified by names but by carefully coded descriptors that protected their identities while tracking their movements toward freedom. This system was far more organized than historically acknowledged, Harrison observed, as patterns emerged from the documentation. These records show coordinated movements across multiple states, synchronized timing of transitions between safe houses, and systematic communication methods. As the experts worked, Thomas sat quietly on the cellar steps, watching the activity with thoughtful contemplation. Rebecca joined him, noticing the complex emotions playing across her father's weathered face. "Everything all right, Dad?" He nodded, slowly. "Just thinking about my grandfather. He used to say our job was to take care of this land, even if we didn't always understand why. Said some things get passed down without explanations, because the explanations might be dangerous in the wrong times." A slight smile crossed his face. Guess he knew more than he let on. The sheriff approached them, having just completed a call with state authorities. "Thought you'd want to know. Commissioner Wilson has been taken into custody for questioning about document falsification. Sterling's trying to distance himself, claiming he was misled by county officials, but they've frozen all Meridian development. Assets pending investigation." This news, which would have seemed momentous hours earlier, now felt almost secondary to the historical revelation unfolding in their cellar. The property that had faced imminent loss through foreclosure had suddenly transformed into something beyond financial valuation. A priceless historical resource whose protection would now be guaranteed through multiple federal and state mechanisms. Dr. Goldman joined them, her expression reflecting both professional satisfaction and personal emotion. "Mr. Hargrove, Ms. Hargrove, what your family unwittingly preserved is already proving to be of exceptional historical significance. The Smithsonian is prepared to immediately implement comprehensive protection measures, including emergency funding to secure the site while formal designation proceeds." 3 years later, Rebecca Hargrove stood on the gentle rise, overlooking what was now officially designated as the Hargrove Underground Railroad Heritage Site. The spring afternoon carried the familiar scents of blooming wildflowers and freshly turned soil that had defined her childhood, but the landscape itself had transformed in ways once unimaginable. Where their struggling family farm had faced foreclosure, a nationally recognized historical preserve now thrived. The original barn stood at its center, meticulously preserved while housing a state-of-the-art conservation facility and educational center. The surrounding fields, still partially maintained as working agricultural land in honor of the property's continuous history, now also featured carefully designed interpretive pathways, allowing visitors to understand how the landscape itself had served as both productive farmland and concealed pathway to freedom. "Quite a change from that auction day," came her father's voice as Thomas joined her on the hillside. At 71, he moved more slowly with his cane, but had regained much of his strength in the years since his stroke. The medical care made possible through the historical site's establishment had enabled a recovery once financially impossible. "I still can't believe how close we came to losing it all," Rebecca replied, watching a group of schoolchildren being guided through the main exhibition hall that had once been their equipment storage building. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Your mother would have loved seeing this. She always said this land had stories to tell if we just listened carefully enough." The discovery in their root cellar had ultimately revealed far more than initially apparent. The preserved documentation had provided unprecedented insights into how the Underground Railroad had functioned as a sophisticated network rather than merely a series of independent safe houses. The coded ledgers, when carefully analyzed by historians and cryptographers, had helped identify previously unknown routes and connections across 5 states. Most significantly, the personal artifacts, items carried and left by individuals passing through, had provided tangible connections to specific journeys toward freedom that had transformed abstract historical narratives into deeply human stories. Each button, handwritten note, and carved figure represented an individual's courage and determination, preserved now not just as historical evidence, but as profound personal testimony. What had begun as one family's desperate fight to save their home had expanded into a comprehensive reassessment of how Underground Railroad history was understood, documented, and presented to the public. The coordination site discovered on the Hargrove farm had led to identification of connected locations throughout the region, many of which had been at risk of development before the significance of the network was understood. Dr. Coleman approached from the visitor center, accompanied by a film crew documenting the site for a national educational series. Perfect timing! They wanted to interview both of you for the segment on how continuous family stewardship inadvertently preserved this historical treasure. Rebecca smiled at the terminology that still occasionally struck her as surreal when applied to their modest family farm. Yet the description was accurate. Generations of Hargroves, without fully understanding what they protected, had maintained the integrity of a site that now educated thousands about a crucial chapter in American history. Just farmers taking care of our land, Thomas replied with characteristic humility. Never expected it would matter to anyone beyond our family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.